April 1945. Patton's army is tearing through southern Germany. They find a POW holding site. The guards aren't soldiers, they're children. Most people know how World War II ended in Europe. Germany surrendered. The Allies won. Flags went up. Soldiers came home. What most people don't know is what the final weeks actually looked like on the ground. Not the big picture, the small picture. The moment a combat-hardened American general pulls up to a holding site and realizes the armed figures in German uniform standing at the gate are not men. They are boys. Some barely teenagers. Some younger. That reality, boys in uniform, rifles in hand, ordered to hold positions, while the adults around them had already fled or surrendered, was one of the most documented and disturbing features of Germany's final collapse. And Patton's Third Army walked straight into it, repeatedly, across southern Germany in the spring of 1945. This is the story of what that actually looked like, what the records say, what the soldiers who were there remembered, and what it reveals about the machinery that put children in that position in the first place. Stay with this one, because the history here is more complicated and more human than most tellings ever get into. To understand what Patton's men were encountering in April 1945, you have to understand what the Hitler Youth program had become by that point. The Hitler Youth, known in German as the Hitler Jugend, was founded in 1922 and became compulsory for German boys in 1939. At its peak in the early 1940s, it had over 8 million members. That number is worth sitting with. 8 million boys, systematically trained in ideology, physical discipline, and eventually paramilitary skills. The program wasn't originally a military pipeline. It started as an ideological youth movement camping, physical fitness, loyalty to the state. But as the war progressed and Germany's losses mounted, the function shifted. By 1943, Hitler Youth members were being integrated into anti-aircraft crews. By 1944, some units were fighting on the Eastern Front. By early 1945, boys as young as 12 were being handed rifles and assigned to defensive positions across Germany. The 12th SS Panzer Division, known as the Hitler Jugend Division, was composed almost entirely of Hitler Youth members, most of them 17 and 18 years old. It fought at Normandy in June 1944. Allied commanders noted with some shock how ferociously these young soldiers fought and how little regard their commanders had for their survival. By April 1945, the organized military units were mostly gone. What remained, in towns and villages, and at holding sites across southern Germany, were the stragglers. Boys who had been given a uniform, a rifle, and an order, and then left behind when the officers retreated. Patton's Third Army was moving through exactly that landscape. The historical record from Third Army's advance through Bavaria in April 1945 is detailed and consistent. American units repeatedly encountered armed Hitler Youth members at checkpoints, at prisoner holding sites, at defensive positions in small towns. These were not combat engagements in the traditional sense. These were situations where experienced American soldiers found themselves facing children, some defiant, some terrified, most somewhere in between, and had to make decisions in real time about how to handle it. The standard procedure that developed, documented in after-action reports and veteran accounts, was to disarm, process, and where possible release the youngest ones, rather than formally incarcerating them as prisoners of war. Boys under 16 were typically separated from adult prisoners. Many were handed to Red Cross personnel or local civilian authorities. Some were simply told to go home. The word home was complicated by 1945. Many of these boys had no home to go back to. German cities had been bombed extensively. Families were scattered. The infrastructure that would normally absorb a child's school, community, family had been severely disrupted or destroyed entirely. UNICEF historical records and post-war Allied occupation documents describe thousands of displaced German children in the immediate aftermath of the war, many of them former Hitler Youth members, navigating a destroyed country with no adult guidance. That context is essential. These weren't just boys who had been misled. These were boys who had been systematically prepared for a war that was now ending around them, and nobody had prepared them for the peace. Patton left a substantial written record: his diaries, official correspondence, and the accounts of his staff are among the most detailed of any American commander in the European theater. His documented views on the final weeks of the German campaign reveal a man grappling seriously with the distinction between combatants and victims. He wrote in his diary during the spring 1945 advance about the condition of German civilians and soldiers he encountered, and specifically about the tragedy of what Germany had done to its own young people. He was not sentimental about the war. He was known for demanding aggressive action, for impatience with hesitation, for pushing his army further and faster than almost any other American commander. But the accounts of his staff from the final weeks in Germany consistently describe moments where his response to encountering child soldiers was notably different from his response to encountering adult combatants. His chief of staff, General Hobart Gay, documented in his own records that Patton repeatedly instructed his officers to exercise judgment when processing very young Germans, that the weight of the Geneva Convention and basic human decency required treating children differently, regardless of what uniform they were wearing. This wasn't softness. Patton framed it practically. A 14-year-old boy holding a position because an adult told him to, and then abandoned him, is not a military threat to be neutralized. He is evidence of what the enemy did to its own people. Treat him accordingly. That framing mattered to the soldiers receiving it. It gave them permission to respond humanely, in situations that the standard rules of engagement hadn't fully anticipated. If you want to understand what these encounters actually felt like, the most powerful sources are the testimonies collected after the war, both from American veterans and from German survivors who were children in 1945. The Imperial War Museum in London holds oral history collections that include accounts from both sides. American veterans describe the disorientation of finding armed children at positions. Several used almost identical language across different interviews: the moment of recognition, the rifle coming up, and then the realization of the face underneath the helmet. Young, scared, not understanding that the war was already over for all practical purposes. German survivors who were Hitler Youth members in 1945 described the abandonment they felt when their commanders disappeared. Boys who had been told they were defending the fatherland found themselves alone at positions with no orders, no food, no communication, and American forces approaching. The ideology that had sustained them, the certainty that Germany would prevail, had collapsed, and nobody had told them what to do next. Several German memoirs from the post-war period describe encounters with American soldiers, including Third Army personnel, in which the American response was to disarm without violence, provide food, and release. For boys who had been conditioned to expect the worst from the enemy, this was genuinely disorienting. Some described it as the moment the propaganda they'd been fed stopped making sense. That moment of disorientation of a child realizing that the framework they'd been given to understand the world was wrong is one of the most documented psychological features of Germany's post-war reconstruction period. This is the part of the story that deserves more attention than it usually gets. The boys found at these positions in April 1945 didn't arm themselves. They didn't volunteer for combat in any meaningful sense. By 1944 and 1945, participation in Hitler Youth paramilitary activities was not voluntary. Boys who refused faced consequences for themselves and their families. The decision to deploy children to defensive positions in the final months of the war came from the top. Hitler signed orders in September 1944, formally incorporating Hitler Youth units into the Volkssturm, the last-ditch people's militia. Boys as young as 16 were officially conscripted. Younger ones were frequently used informally, assigned by local commanders who needed bodies to hold positions regardless of age. The International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg addressed the Hitler Youth program directly. The tribunal documented how the organization had been used to systematically militarize an entire generation, how it had stripped boys of normal childhood development and replaced it with ideological conditioning and paramilitary training. This was treated not as education policy, but as a crime against the children themselves. That verdict matters. It establishes clearly, in the post-war legal record, that the boys Patton's army encountered were victims of the regime, not instruments of it in any freely chosen sense. They were children who had been handed rifles by adults, who then ran away. The human cost of Germany's decision to use child soldiers in the final phase of the war is documented and significant. Casualty records and post-war demographic studies estimate that tens of thousands of Hitler Youth members died in combat between 1944 and 1945. The 12th SS Panzer Division alone suffered catastrophic losses at Normandy and in subsequent engagements. Boys who had been in school 2 years earlier were dying in tank battles and artillery exchanges across France and Germany. The psychological cost on the survivors was equally documented. Post-war studies of German youth conducted by Allied occupation authorities and early West German researchers found high rates of disorientation, identity crisis, and difficulty reintegrating into civilian life among former Hitler Youth members. They had been trained for a war that ended. They had been given a purpose, fanatical, destructive, but a purpose, and then the purpose disappeared overnight. Rebuilding a generation that had been shaped entirely around an ideology required decades. German educators and psychologists in the 1950s and 1960s wrote extensively about this challenge. How do you teach critical thinking to young people whose entire formation had been built on the opposite? The answer, slowly and imperfectly, was time, democratic education, and the deliberate dismantling of the myths they'd been raised on. Patton died in December 1945, 8 months after the German surrender, from injuries sustained in a vehicle accident in Mannheim. He never saw the post-war reconstruction. He never saw what Germany became. But the approach his army took in those final weeks, the documented policy of treating child soldiers as victims requiring processing, rather than enemies requiring prosecution, had real consequences for what came after. The boys who were disarmed and released in April and May 1945 became part of the first post-war German generation. Some of them went on to build the Federal Republic. Some became educators, engineers, politicians, fathers. The decision made by American commanders, including Patton's explicit guidance to his officers, to treat the youngest ones humanely, rather than as combatants, contributed, in a small but real way, to what West Germany was able to become. That's not a small thing. It's a documented chain of consequence that runs from a decision made in a field in Bavaria in April 1945, all the way to the democratic Germany that emerged over the following decades. Here is what the spring of 1945 actually looked like in southern Germany. A destroyed country, a collapsing army, and children 12, 13, 14 years old standing at positions with rifles, wearing uniforms that didn't fit, following orders from commanders who had already gone. Patton's army dealt with this reality hundreds of times across the final weeks of the war. The decisions made in those moments to see the child, not just the uniform, were not just acts of individual decency. They were policy, documented and deliberate, shaped in part by commanders who understood that what you do with a 14-year-old boy at the end of a war says something about what kind of peace you're building. The question this history keeps raising is a simple one. When a system uses children as its last line of defense, who bears responsibility? The child holding the rifle? Or the adults who put it in his hands and walked away? The Nuremberg Tribunal gave its answer in 1946. What's yours? If this video made you think differently about something you thought you already knew, that's exactly what this channel is for. Subscribe to WW2 Forgotten Frontline. Every story here is documented, sourced, and told without the shortcuts. Like the video if the history landed. It helps more people find content that takes the real story seriously.